The morning of October 14, 1943, started like any other suicide mission. At 8:21 a.m., nearly 300 B-17 flying fortresses banked toward Schweinfurt, deep in the German heartland. Their target, the ball-bearing plants that kept Hitler's war machine grinding forward. Within the hour, their P-47 Thunderbolt escorts would peel away, fuel tanks empty, leaving the bombers exposed for the final 400 miles. The mathematics of death were simple and brutal. Every mile beyond escort range meant more bombers falling from the sky, more 10-man crews plummeting to earth in burning metal coffins. This wasn't theoretical. 2 months prior, 60 bombers had been obliterated in a single August day. Just a week earlier, 30 more had gone down over Bremen. The air crews had stopped calling them missions. They were death sentences with wings attached. The P-47s were magnificent machines, the finest fighters the 8th Air Force possessed. But physics didn't care about magnificence. They could protect the bombers for exactly 175 miles before fuel forced them homeward. The P-38 Lightning stretched that to 300 miles with drop tanks. Berlin sat 580 miles distant. The Ruhr Valley was 400 miles deep. American military doctrine had promised that bomber formations, bristling with 13.50 caliber machine guns each, would create such murderous crossfire that German fighters couldn't penetrate. This theory had been conceived by men who'd never witnessed a Focke-Wulf 190 screaming down at 400 miles per hour, cannons blazing like the fist of an angry god. Near Aachen, the Thunderbolts waggled their wings in farewell and turned for home. The bombers pressed on, alone. What transpired next earned its place in history as Black Thursday. Of 291 bombers launched that morning, 60 were destroyed. 600 men killed or captured in 5 hours of hell. 17 more bombers limped home, so shattered they'd never fly again. Another 121 bore reparable damage. The 8th Air Force had hemorrhaged over 20% of its striking power in one mission. At this casualty rate, the entire bomber fleet would cease to exist after 5 more operations. Strategic bombing wasn't just failing, it was dying. The entire war effort teetered on collapse. Meanwhile, in a filing cabinet at Wright Field, Ohio, a report gathered dust. A report about a fighter aircraft the Army Air Forces had dismissed for 2 years. A fighter that could have prevented Black Thursday entirely. That fighter was the P-51 Mustang. And its story begins not in the Pentagon or at some strategic planning session, but in a California office where a company president made an impossible promise to a desperate British buyer. January 1940. James Howard Kindleberger ran North American aviation with the methodical precision of a man who understood contracts and delivery schedules. His company manufactured trainers, the At-6 Texan that taught young pilots their craft. Reliable, predictable, profitable. Fighters were different beasts entirely. They demanded cutting-edge aerodynamics, engines that produced maximum power at altitude, engineering teams with years of specialized experience. North American aviation possessed none of these advantages. When Sir Henry Self from the British Purchasing Commission arrived at Kindleberger's office, he wasn't seeking innovation. Britain needed fighters immediately, quantity over quality. France had collapsed. The Battle of Britain loomed. The RAF would accept anything that could fly and shoot. Self wanted North American to manufacture Curtiss P-40 fighters under license. The P-40 wasn't exceptional, it was adequate. Decent at low altitude, struggling above 15,000 feet. But Britain needed numbers, not perfection. Kindleberger listened, then made a counteroffer that seemed insane. North American could design and build an entirely new fighter, superior to the P-40, in 120 days. 4 months from blank paper to flying prototype. Self assumed Kindleberger was either delusional or lying. Nobody designed fighters that quickly. But he gave North American 120 days to prove it. What Self didn't know, North American's chief designer Edgar Schmud had been sketching a revolutionary fighter for months. Schmud was a German immigrant who'd arrived in America in 1931, self-taught but brilliant, obsessed with aerodynamic efficiency. Born in 1899 in Hornbach, Germany, Schmud had served as an aircraft mechanic in World War I with Austro-Hungarian aviation troops. After the war, he'd worked for Fokker in Brazil before immigrating to the United States. He joined North American in 1936, bringing with him a unique design philosophy. Every aircraft component should serve multiple purposes. A structural member should also be an aerodynamic surface. A cooling duct should produce thrust. A fuel tank should provide structural integrity. This integrated design philosophy would make the Mustang the most efficient fighter of the entire war. For 2 years, Schmud had studied existing fighter designs, cataloging their mistakes. The P-40's radiator hung below the fuselage, creating enormous drag. The P-39's engine, mounted behind the pilot, caused balance problems. The Spitfire's beautiful elliptical wings were manufacturing nightmares. Schmud would avoid every one of these errors. When Kindleberger made his promise to the British, Schmud already had the design in his head. He just needed to build it. The challenge wasn't merely technical, it was organizational. North American had never built a fighter. The company's engineers understood trainers and bombers, not high-performance combat aircraft. Schmud had to educate his team while designing the plane, teaching fighter design principles while racing against that 120-day deadline. Schmud assembled his team carefully. Raymond Rice for structural design, Larry Waite for systems integration, Ed Horkey for aerodynamics, Art Chester for power plant installation. They worked 18-hour days, 7 days weekly. They ate at their desks, slept in the factory. While Britain fought for survival and France collapsed, 5 men in California raced to create a fighter from nothing. The pressure was crushing. If they failed, Britain might lose the war. If they succeeded, they'd create something unprecedented. A fighter that could be mass-produced like an automobile, yet perform like a thoroughbred. The design they produced was unlike anything flying. The wings used laminar flow airfoils developed with NACA, NASA's predecessor. These wings maintained smooth airflow far longer than conventional wings, dramatically reducing drag. The cooling system was revolutionary. Instead of draggy external radiators, Schmud buried the radiator in the fuselage behind the pilot. The heated air exiting the radiator would actually produce thrust, converting waste heat into propulsion. The Meredith effect, theorized by British engineers, but never successfully implemented until now. Every surface was mathematically calculated for minimum drag. The fuselage utilized conic sections, producing perfectly smooth surfaces. The airframe divided into 5 major sections that could be built separately and assembled quickly. 78,000 man-hours later, on September 9, 1940, the prototype rolled from the hangar. They'd beaten the deadline by 18 days. The NA-73X was beautiful. Even stationary, it looked fast. The problem, it had no engine. Allison was late delivering the V-1710. On October 26, 1940, test pilot Vance Breeze took the NA-73X up for its maiden flight. The aircraft exceeded every performance target. It reached 390 miles per hour, faster than any American fighter in production. Stable, responsive, easy to fly. The British immediately ordered 320 aircraft. They named it the Mustang. Early testing revealed both promise and limitations. The laminar flow wing performed exactly as Schmud predicted. The radiator scoop, which critics claimed would create excessive drag, actually produced slight thrust. But problems existed. The Allison engine, excellent at low altitude, gasped above 15,000 feet. Its single-stage supercharger couldn't compress sufficient air at altitude. While Spitfires fought effectively at 25,000 feet, the Mustang struggled above 15,000. The British found their solution. Use Mustangs for low-altitude tactical reconnaissance and ground attack, where speed and range mattered more than altitude performance. The first Mustangs reached Britain in October 1941. Number 26 Squadron at Gatwick received them first. Pilots were initially skeptical. The Mustang looked different from British fighters. Longer nose, cockpit set farther back, straighter wings. It didn't look like a fighter. It looked like a racing plane. But when they flew it, skepticism vanished. Squadron leader Jeffrey Page reported, "It was like stepping from a cart horse to a thoroughbred. The speed, acceleration, stability, everything was superior." The RAF immediately deployed Mustangs on rhubarb missions, low-level sweeps over occupied France. Flying 50 feet above the English Channel to avoid German radar, Mustang pilots would cross the French coast at maximum speed, strafe airfields, attack trains, shoot up convoys, then race home before German fighters could intercept. These missions were dangerous but effective, forcing Germans to maintain fighter defenses across the entire coast, diluting their strength. On May 10, 1942, Flying Officer Hollis Hills of 414 Squadron became the first Mustang pilot to destroy a German aircraft, a Focke-Wulf 190, over France. By August, RAF Mustangs had claimed 20 German aircraft. But these were minor victories compared to what was possible. The Mustang's real potential remained locked behind the limitations of its Allison engine. The United States Army Air Forces wasn't interested. When two examples arrived at Wright Field in 1941 for evaluation, they sat on the ramp for months, with only 1 hour of test flying logged. The Army Air Forces was committed to other fighters: Republic's P-47, Lockheed's P-38, Bell's P-39, Curtiss's P-40. The Mustang was seen as a British project, built for foreign money, irrelevant to American needs. The evaluation report, when finally written, acknowledged excellent low-altitude performance, but criticized high-altitude limitations due to the Allison engine's single-stage supercharger. The resistance at Wright Field was both institutional and personal. Major General Oliver Eccles, chief of the Material Division, had already committed the Army Air Forces to the P-47 as its primary fighter. Eccles controlled procurement for the entire organization. His word determined what planes were built, what engines developed, what weapons deployed. He saw the Mustang as a distraction from established programs. The P-47 was American, American-powered, American-built. The Mustang was tainted by British origins. Wright Field's test pilots filed lukewarm reports. They complained about cockpit layout, gun arrangement, fuel systems. They found fault with everything except the plane's actual performance, which exceeded every American fighter then in production. One test pilot claimed the Mustang handled like a truck compared to the P-40. This was technically accurate at very low speeds, but irrelevant in combat, where speed and acceleration mattered more than slow speed handling. The bureaucratic resistance extended beyond Wright Field. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, initially showed no interest. He focused on heavy bombers, believing strategic bombing would win the war. Fighters were defensive weapons, necessary but not decisive. Arnold's staff reflected his priorities. They allocated resources to bomber production, bases, crews. Fighters received what was left over. Even when the British demonstrated the Mustang's potential, American officials remained skeptical. In July 1942, the RAF used Mustangs for the first long-range reconnaissance mission over Germany, England to Cologne and back, 800 miles. The Mustangs photographed German installations and returned without loss. Wright Field's response: order more reconnaissance versions, not fighters. The Army Air Forces ordered no Mustangs for combat. Instead, they ordered 500 modified as dive bombers, designated A-36 Apache, and 310 as reconnaissance aircraft. But as a fighter, the plane that would eventually save the bomber offensive, it was ignored. The Mustang went to war with the Royal Air Force, while the United States Army Air Forces continued losing bombers at catastrophic rates. The man who changed everything wasn't a general or Pentagon official. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, Jr. was 41 years old, too old for combat flying, but he possessed connections reaching the highest power levels. In World War I, at 17, he joined the Lafayette Flying Corps, scored 3 victories, been shot down, captured, then escaped from a German POW camp by jumping from a moving train and walking 100 miles to Switzerland. Between wars, he became one of the world's greatest polo players and a successful investment banker. When World War II began, Hitchcock volunteered for combat, but was rejected for being overage. Instead, through his friend John Wynant, American ambassador to Britain, he became assistant air attaché at the embassy in London. It was supposed to be a desk job. Hitchcock transformed it into a one-man crusade to revolutionize American fighter aviation. In April 1942, Ronald Harker, a Rolls-Royce test pilot, flew a Mustang for the first time. He was astonished by its low-altitude performance, range handling. But above 15,000 feet, the Allison engine wheezed and struggled. Harker had an idea that seemed obvious in retrospect, but was revolutionary at the time. Install a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in the Mustang. The Merlin possessed a two-stage supercharger maintaining power to 30,000 feet. It powered Spitfires and Lancaster bombers. If fitted to the Mustang, it would create the ultimate fighter. Rolls-Royce began converting 5 Mustangs to Merlin power in June 1942. The first flew in October. Results were spectacular. The Merlin-powered Mustang reached 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison version. At that altitude, it climbed to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. It possessed range to reach Berlin and return. When Hitchcock saw the test results, he immediately understood their significance. This was the plane that could save the bomber offensive. This was the fighter that could win the air war. But when he reported results to Washington, the Army Air Forces wasn't interested. The Mustang remained a British project. The United States had committed to the P-47 and P-38. Pentagon officials didn't want to disrupt production for an unproven hybrid design. Hitchcock was stunned by the rejection. American bombers were being slaughtered for lack of escort fighters, and the solution sat right before them. Military bureaucracy couldn't see past its own prejudices and institutional inertia. Wright Field, the Army Air Forces Testing Center, was committed to American designs with American engines. The Mustang with a British engine was considered almost traitorous. But Hitchcock hadn't survived a German prison camp and walked across Switzerland to surrender now. If official channels wouldn't work, he'd circumvent them. He began what his biographer called a guerrilla campaign to force Army Air Forces acceptance of the Merlin Mustang. He flooded Washington with performance data. He invited influential friends to watch flight demonstrations. He hosted dinner parties where he cornered generals and undersecretaries. He wrote directly to General Arnold, bypassing the entire chain of command. Arnold initially dismissed Hitchcock's appeals. The Army Air Forces had invested too much in existing fighters to change course. But Hitchcock had one advantage. He knew Robert Lovett, Assistant Secretary of War for Air. Lovett and Hitchcock had flown together in World War I. When Hitchcock flew to Washington in November 1942, he went straight to Lovett's office. He brought test data from Britain, photographs of the Merlin Mustang, performance charts showing its superiority to every American fighter. Lovett understood immediately. He'd been watching bomber loss rates. He knew the strategic bombing campaign was failing without long-range escort. Lovett confronted Arnold directly. Bomber losses were unsustainable. The 8th Air Force was being bled white. Either they found a long-range escort fighter or the daylight bombing campaign would have to be abandoned. Arnold, pressured from above and below, finally relented. In November 1942, he ordered 2,200 P-51 Mustangs with Packard-built Merlin engines. North American Aviation would produce them at Inglewood, California, and a new plant in Dallas, Texas. But ordering planes and getting them into combat were different things. Production didn't begin until June 1943. The first P-51 didn't reach England until November 1943. By then, the 8th Air Force had lost over 1,000 bombers. 10,000 men were dead or captured. The delay had cost lives that could have been saved. The technical challenges of producing the Merlin Mustang were enormous. Packard Motor Company had to retool Detroit factories to build the Merlin engine under license. Every component required conversion from British to American measurements. Every specification needed translation from British to American standards. Packard engineers discovered that Rolls-Royce craftsmen hand-fitted many parts during assembly, adjusting each engine individually for optimal performance. This was impossible in mass production. Packard had to redesign components for interchangeability while maintaining engine performance. The first Packard Merlin, designated V1650, came off the production line in August 1942. It produced 1,490 horsepower at takeoff and maintained power to 30,000 feet. When installed in the Mustang airframe, it transformed aircraft performance. Top speed increased from 390 miles per hour to 441 miles per hour. Service ceiling rose from 31,000 feet to 42,000 feet. More importantly, the Mustang could now fight effectively at altitudes where bomber formations flew. North American aviation faced its own production challenges. The Inglewood, California plant was already at capacity, building B-25 Mitchell bombers. To produce Mustangs in quantity, North American had to build an entirely new factory in Dallas, Texas. Construction began April 1943. The first Dallas-built Mustang, designated P-51C to distinguish it from California-built P-51B, rolled off the assembly line in August 1943. The two models were identical except for production location. Meanwhile, the 8th Air Force bled. Summer and fall 1943 brought catastrophic bomber losses. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid on August 17th cost 60 bombers. The Bremen raid on October 8th lost 30. Munster on October 10th lost another 30. Bomber crews calculated survival odds with grim mathematics. At current loss rates, a crew had a 1 in 4 chance of completing their 25-mission tour. Morale collapsed. Some crews refused to fly. The strategic bombing campaign teetered on the edge of failure. The 354th Fighter Group was the first unit to receive Merlin-powered Mustangs. Based at Boxstead, Essex, pilots had been flying P-39s, a mediocre fighter nicknamed the Flying Coffin. When they saw their new P-51 BS, they couldn't believe the difference. The acceleration was incredible. It climbed like a rocket. At 25,000 feet, where the P-39 barely functioned, the Mustang was just getting started. The first escort mission with P-51 Mustangs was flown December 5, 1943, to Amiens, France, a short mission, well within P-47 range, intended to test the new fighters. They performed flawlessly. On December 13th, Mustangs escorted bombers to Kiel, Germany, 400 miles from base. For the first time, American fighters provided protection deep into German airspace. On December 20th, Mustangs flew to Bremen. On January 7, 1944, they escorted bombers to Ludwigshafen, 500 miles from England. The impact was immediate and dramatic. In October 1943, before Mustangs arrived, the 8th Air Force lost 9.1% of bombers attacking targets. In January 1944, with limited Mustang escort, losses dropped to 6.3%. By February, with more Mustangs arriving, losses fell to 3.5%. Bomber crews called the Mustangs little friends. For the first time since the bombing campaign began, they had protection all the way to target and back. Mustang pilots quickly developed tactics, maximizing their effectiveness. Instead of staying close to bomber formations, they ranged ahead and to the sides, hunting German fighters before they could attack. Colonel Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group pioneered these aggressive tactics. He told his pilots to forget defensive flying, attack everything, chase Germans to their airfields, shoot them down while landing, make them afraid to take off. The results were devastating for the Luftwaffe. Major James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group single-handedly defended an entire bomber formation on January 11, 1944. Alone, separated from his squadron, Howard attacked 30 German fighters. He shot down 4, probably destroyed 2 more, damaged 2 others. For 30 minutes, he was the only fighter defending the bombers. He received the Medal of Honor. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group became known as Ace of Aces. Flying his Mustang, named Shangri-La, Gentile shot down 21.83 German aircraft in air combat and destroyed 6 more on the ground. His wingman, Lieutenant John Godfrey, shot down 18 aircraft. Together, they formed the most successful fighter team in the 8th Air Force. General Dwight Eisenhower called Gentile a one-man air force. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group achieved the highest score of any Mustang pilot. On August 6, 1944, Preddy shot down 6 Me-109s in a single mission. Despite suffering from a hangover, Preddy led his squadron against a formation of 30 German fighters attacking bombers over Hamburg. In minutes of combat, Preddy destroyed 6 enemy aircraft, saving dozens of bombers. He would eventually shoot down 26.83 German aircraft before being killed by American anti-aircraft fire on Christmas Day 1944, a tragic case of friendly fire. But the Real Revolution came March 4, 1944. On that date, the first American fighters appeared over Berlin. 68 Mustangs escorted 660 B-17 and B-24 bombers to the German capital. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, later said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." The technical reasons for the Mustang's superiority were straightforward. With internal fuel and drop tanks, it could fly 1,300 miles. The P-47, even with maximum external fuel, managed only 600 miles. The Mustang cruised at 325 miles per hour while using less fuel than a P-47 used at 250 miles per hour. At 25,000 feet, the Mustang was 50 mph faster than a P-47 and 70 mph faster than a Messerschmitt Bf 109. More importantly, the Mustang changed the entire nature of air war. Previously, American fighters had been defensive, protecting bombers from attack. The Mustang was offensive. After escorting bombers to targets, Mustangs would drop to low altitude and strafe German airfields, destroying planes on the ground. They'd hunt German fighters trying to land, catching them low on fuel and ammunition. They'd patrol German training areas, shooting down instructors and students before they could become operational pilots. By April 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing more planes than it could replace. More critically, it was losing experienced pilots faster than it could train new ones. In April and May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 800 fighters and 600 pilots. The Mustang wasn't just protecting bombers, it was destroying the Luftwaffe's ability to fight. German pilots who survived spoke with a mixture of respect and fear about the Mustang. Major Wilhelm Gath of Jagerschwader 26 recalled, "We could no longer predict where American fighters would be. They were everywhere, above us, behind us, waiting at our airfields. The Mustang had range to follow us anywhere. We'd lost control of our own airspace." Lieutenant General Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, understood the implications immediately. The Mustang wasn't just another fighter. It was a strategic weapon that neutralized Germany's geographic advantage. For 3 years, Germany's heartland had been protected by distance. Allied fighters couldn't reach Berlin, Munich, or the vital industrial Ruhr. German factories could produce weapons in relative safety. German training bases could prepare new pilots without interference. The Mustang destroyed that sanctuary. By June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed at Normandy, the Luftwaffe could manage only 300 sorties over the invasion beaches. The Allies flew 14,600 sorties the same day. The air superiority that made D-Day possible had been won by the Mustang. The statistics tell the story. In 1943, before Mustangs arrived, American fighters claimed a ratio of 1 German fighter shot down for every 1.2 American fighters lost. By early 1944, with Mustangs operating in numbers, the ratio changed to 4 German fighters shot down for every Mustang lost. By war's end, Mustang pilots had destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in aerial combat and 4,131 on the ground. But the man most responsible for the Mustang's success wouldn't live to see victory. On April 19, 1944, Thomas Hitchcock was testing a P-51 at Salisbury, England, when his plane crashed. He was killed instantly. Edgar Schmud, the designer who created the Mustang, received no official recognition during the war. His name appeared in no reports. He was never decorated or promoted. After the war, he continued designing aircraft for North American, creating the F-86 Sabre jet that would dominate in Korea. When asked about the Mustang years later, Schmud said simply, "We just built what they asked for. The British asked for a good airplane. We gave them one." The institutional resistance that nearly killed the Mustang was never officially acknowledged. The Army Air Force's history of World War II mentions only that the Mustang was developed for the British and later adopted by American forces. No mention of the 2-year delay, the bureaucratic opposition, the fact that Wright Field ignored the plane while bombers were being slaughtered. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, said after the war, "The Mustang won the air war over Europe. Without it, the invasion would have been impossible. The bombers couldn't have continued. We would have lost." The broader lesson of the Mustang wasn't about technology. It was about institutional blindness. The United States Army Air Forces had built an entire doctrine around self-defending bombers. When that doctrine failed, catastrophically, the institution couldn't admit its error. It took an outsider, Hitchcock, operating outside normal channels, to force change. It took a foreign power, Britain, to recognize the Mustang's potential when its own country wouldn't. It took unnecessary losses, thousands of deaths that could have been prevented, before reality overwhelmed bureaucracy. Between October 1943 and March 1944, approximately 2,000 American airmen were killed or captured in missions that Mustang escort could have protected. These weren't statistics. They were young men with families, dreams, futures cut short because bureaucrats at Wright Field couldn't see past their prejudices. North American Aviation built 15,586 Mustangs during the war. They served in every theater with every Allied Air Force. After the war, they continued flying in Korea during the Israeli War of Independence and in dozens of other conflicts. The last military Mustangs were retired by the Dominican Air Force in 1984. Today, about 300 Mustangs still exist, with half still flying. They're preserved not as weapons, but as reminders of what almost wasn't. The P-51 Mustang changed the air war over Europe. It made the invasion of Normandy possible. It saved countless Allied lives. But its greatest achievement wasn't what it did, it was what it represented. The triumph of innovation over bureaucracy, of performance over politics, of results over regulations. It was proof that sometimes the best weapon is the one the system doesn't want. Sometimes the most important victories are won not on battlefields, but in conference rooms and corridors where decisions are made or avoided, where planes are ordered or ignored, where wars are won or lost before they're ever fought.